Hello and welcome to the 10th and final webinar by Search for Common Ground on Countering Violent Extremism. In this video, we'll explore what monitoring and evaluation are, as well as the unique challenges that we face when trying to evaluate this kind of programming. First, we need to understand what is monitoring and evaluation, and why are they important for what we do. Well, monitoring is data collection throughout the duration of the program to assess changes or indicators along the way and make appropriate changes if necessary. On the other hand, evaluation is a systematic assessment of a program to determine its impact and effectiveness based on predetermined benchmarks, standards, and goals. Now, monitoring and evaluation for countering violent extremism programming can be especially challenging, and that's because it can be costly as well as really technical or advanced, and can sometimes require special training and skills to do well. One particular issue that we often face is because our work focuses on changing beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors, it's hard for us to observe these kinds of changes in the short term or even at all. For example, when we look at the fact that some of these attitudes are deeply held, it can be hard to just simply ask participants about changes in attitudes, especially when those attitudes may not be socially desirable, such as holding extreme views on another group or being justifications for the use of violence. In addition, countering violent extremism programs are not always labeled as countering violent extremism, and could sometimes be framed instead as youth empowerment projects, for example, or employment or educational projects. And because of this, it makes it hard to monitor and evaluate specific behaviors and attitudes that would be more in line with a project that works to address violent extremism. And this is because the kinds of questions we might ask would just simply come across as strange. Finally, because our programs often have many activities that engage on a broader approach, it's often difficult to connect all the different activities to the kinds of changes and impacts that we observe, to necessarily highlight which activities were the most effective, for example. This is particularly difficult when evaluating and monitoring online activities, when we have limited access to the information about those that interact with our online outputs. Next, because our projects are often implemented in particularly tense areas or even in zones of conflict, there are also a number of external factors in the contexts and environments, and even the political sphere, that can influence the kinds of outcomes and impacts that we may see. Sometimes these external factors can even make our activities appear useless when, for example, there's a large breakout of violence and therefore a lot of radicalization occurs. On the other hand, they can even make our activities appear incredibly successful if there are external factors such as a peace agreement that causes radicalization to decrease, or perhaps a ceasefire. And when those things are unrelated to the project at hand, they can kind of cloud the outcomes and the impact of our projects. So we must be careful. We just have to be aware of these external factors. Now, much like the environment, the kinds of changes in behaviors, attitudes, and approaches can also be dynamic, and they may not happen in a logical sequence. Therefore, some of the more rigid monitoring and evaluation tools or logical models that we put together to try and evaluate these changes may not even be flexible enough to observe them when they occur, and also presents challenges when our activities based on changing needs or priorities have to be amended as well. Finally, because violent extremism is actually so rare, even in the so-called hotspots that we often work, it's usually difficult to observe changes on a community level in a measurable way. We should be sure to take these challenges into consideration in the design phase and plan accordingly. We can do this by articulating the theory of change, and that's a theory of how the project will likely bring about certain positive changes. Now, we can elaborate on that design process by setting good goals, objectives, and activities to help us reach our intended impact, and identify how we'll measure the degree of achievement of our objectives or the accomplishment of our activities. We can do that by planning for the time and manner in which we will engage in our monitoring and evaluation activities. And that's both during and after programming. Finally, and just like setting aside the time, we also need to set aside the resources to be sure that we can deliver good quality evaluation and monitoring efforts to our programming. Now, central to good monitoring and evaluation is again this idea of the theory of change. Now, a theory of change is an explanation of the causal links from activities to the intended outputs, to subsequent outcomes, and finally to the intended impact. Now, the outputs are the results of our activities or services in our programs. They're measurable, and they're often recorded in terms of the units completed, such as those listed here on your screen. Outcomes are the changes in behaviors, attitudes, or actions as a result of activities or services, and they're really about what changes are occurring because of our programming. It's important to note that these changes can be intended or unintended, and there's a list of examples here of outcomes on your screen. Finally, the impact of a program is the measurable effects or changes that a program has on the target population. Like outcomes, impact can be intended or unintended. It can be direct or indirect. And it's usually the intended overall goal of a particular project or policy. But it's important for us to capture all of these impacts, whether they're intended or not. Really, impact is much more of a longer term change. And oftentimes the impact of a project is set by donors who offer funds to achieve certain impact goals. So these changes, whether at the output, outcome, or impact levels, can all be measured with the use of special tools we call indicators, which can simply be a planned source of measurement. Indicators are measurements of types and processes of change. Now, if we were to just go back to each of the other levels that we just learned about, we would be able to develop indicators to measure each of these changes. Let's take into consideration the following good practices in monitoring and evaluation of our Countering Violent Extremism programming. First, we need to ensure that our monitoring and evaluation is led by objectives that we've set, and that it's usable for ourselves or practitioners and our audience, and that our objectives are achievable and valid for our needs. Second, we should begin the design process with the community's needs and the context that they're in. We should also be sure to always have a conflict-sensitive and a do-no-harm approach at all levels of our programming, and this really includes monitoring and evaluation. We should also be sure to look for ways to incorporate gender into every point of the monitoring and evaluation process. This can actually be pretty simple. It can be as simple as asking how many men and how many women are attending activities, so we're not leaving anyone behind. And it can even be disaggregating the results of our activities by gender so that we can be sure that men and women are both benefiting from our projects, to be sure that they're not facing risks from their involvement. And if there are risks or benefits, how they correlate by gender. So therefore, as we design our theory of change and our programs, we should be sure to allow for a certain level of flexibility in our design that will allow us to pursue new opportunities that arise or changes in the context, for example, or to adapt in ways that avoid risks. Finally, as we draft a theory of change, we should frequently refer to it so that we can maintain the necessary focus of our program on those intended impacts so that we're best able to achieve them. Now, we should use the evaluation process at the end of our programming to really investigate whether the outputs, outcomes, and impact are truly linked together in the ways that we assumed when we drafted our theory of change. We should also use local researchers or organizations in the monitoring and evaluation process so that we have people that understand the context fully, that speak the local language, and that have better access to participants and partners, but they should also understand the countering violent extremism field. In order to protect our implementers and beneficiaries, we should be sure to safeguard the data from our monitoring and evaluation programs. Now, monitoring and evaluation processes should seek to engage governments, local researchers, and partners in the design process so they can all benefit from the results, especially when we share those results with the intention of helping others to learn what works or even what doesn't work in a particular context. As we wrap up this webinar series, we would encourage you to consider the following key takeaways. First, monitoring and evaluation is really the process that works to determine what approaches are effective in this kind of work. Of course, because of its sensitive nature, this can be very challenging, but we should also look to other fields and benefit from their insights and lessons learned in those fields on how to overcome the challenges that we will likely face in our monitoring and evaluation of countering violent extremism efforts. Some examples of other fields could include the field of crime prevention or peace building. Finally, we should move forward confident that we can achieve this monitoring and evaluation goals with an awareness that there's a variety of quantitative and qualitative tools to help us evaluate the effectiveness of countering violent extremism efforts. Now, this is a good opportunity to encourage you once again to download the curriculum in the link in the description below, which will explore these issues in greater detail and point you to a number of great tools and resources that can help you as you design a particular programming or policy and seek ways to monitor and evaluate them. Thank you so much for viewing this webinar and this series in general, and we wish you great success in all of your efforts.